I want to return to some of the big political and other news stories of the day. I'm joined now by the Liberal MP Julian Leeser from Sydney. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon.
Thanks, David.
Look, a lot of concern around the Australian dual citizen Yang Hengjun, who's now been arrested in China on an espionage charge. This is pretty serious. The Foreign Minister's expressed a strong statement expressing her concern and disappointment. What do you make of this development?
Look, I think it is a very disturbing development. I read the Foreign Minister's statement. Dr Yang has been held in harsh conditions in China. He's been held for several months. It's finally been revealed it's an espionage matter. He hasn't seen his family since he's been held. He hasn't had access to lawyers. And what the government is calling on is that international human rights law apply to him, that he be treated in a humane way, that he continue to have the consular visits that he's been having, and that the usual things that would apply to a person in those circumstances apply. But it's a very disturbing development, and I think Australians have a right to feel concerned.
Is he essentially a political prisoner?
Look, I wouldn't want to call it that, but I think people are concerned about the fact that he's been charged with espionage. He's a political scientist. He's a writer. He's well known for those things, and he's an Australian citizen. They are not things that in Australia one would be detained for, but I think we need to find out more about what's going on. But the way in which he's been held, the fact that he's been held for so long, the fact that he hasn't had access to lawyers, the fact that he hasn't seen his family is very, very disturbing.
This really goes to the nub of the concerns when it comes to China, the concerns about free speech and a fair trial. In both, we see, well, a lack of either, really, from China, a willingness to accept free speech and a willingness to have a transparent justice process. Do you agree?
Well, China is not a democracy in the way that Australia is a democracy. China does not have a system that has the same standards of the rule of law that we have in this country. And people who go to China and do business with China and work in China have to remember that at the end of the day. I think one of the things that is so important about liberal democracy are those two values: the freedom of speech, the freedom to criticise government, and the rule of law, that you'll be judged fairly according to due process and not arbitrarily detained. And I think that that's a very important value of Western democracies like our own.
So is the lesson for any Australian writer, journalist, academic, author who has criticised China, don't go there?
Well, I think people who go to China have to realise that the Chinese legal system is very different to our own, and that people won't necessarily be subjected to the same legal presumptions that you'd be subjected to in the Australian system, and that they don't have the same liberties and freedoms that we in Australia take for granted. And I think that Dr Yang's circumstances is an example of that.
Look, the Foreign Minister and you have expressed disappointment and concern here. I note the Nationals leader, the Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack, when asked, said, "It's not for me to say whether I'm disappointed or not." He went on to talk about making every trade opportunity, taking advantage of every possible trade opportunity. Does that really go to the confusion here within the government about what to do when it comes to China, whether to chase the dollars or to strongly stand up against these sort of blows to freedom?
David, I don't think there's confusion. I think there's an acknowledgement that the trade relationship is very important. China remains our largest trading partner. We have goods, commodities particularly, and education, which is very important to China, and we trade a lot of goods with them that are very important to Australian consumers as well. But it's a more and more complex relationship, whether it's around security issues or whether it's around the protection of Australian citizens who travel to China. There are complexities to the relationship. What we need to do as Australians is to be alive to those complexities as part of that very important trading relationship.
So are you saying we can have all the goodies of the trade relationship, but a different view over a pretty important legal matter here?
Yes, that's effectively what I'm saying. I think that the trade relationship is very important. There are many people's jobs that depend on it, but we need to be realistic about the nature of China. It's a different country with a different system to our own, and we need to be realistic when we're trading and engaging with China as a global citizen.
Would you expect the Prime Minister to raise this if he gets the opportunity at, say, the APEC summit later this year with the Chinese President?
Well, I saw the Foreign Minister's statement. It is a very strong statement from the Foreign Minister, worded in diplomatic language, but it's pretty clear there. I would imagine in bilateral meetings from time to time these sorts of issues would be raised, but you know, the diplomacy that is engaged in relation to these things is often best conducted behind closed doors rather than telegraphed in the media.
A couple of other things. The G7 summit, the Prime Minister's wrapped up his meetings there. We've seen some encouraging language from Donald Trump and encouraging signs from China when it comes to their trade war. How optimistic are you that we might be on a better path now?
Well, I'm always hopeful that we will be. Obviously, free trade and a stable trade relationship as between China and America, because that affects other countries like Australia. Free trade is very important to us. It's very important to us because we produce more than we can consume of our own commodities and services here. And so we want to be able to trade around the world. And if two of our biggest trading partners are having trade disputes, that unsettles the global trading system. So we've been encouraging America and China to sit down and work out their differences and to come back to the table and to continue to trade.
There's little, I suppose, that we or anyone else can do to solve that trade dispute. What we can do in our domestic economy, though, is perhaps something worth debating. The Treasurer, as you've seen this week, has been... Just
let me address that, David. I think
sure.
It's very important that Australia continues to be a strong advocate for free trade. It's in our national interest, but I also think it's in global interests. And I think it's important that countries like ours make the case for free trade continually.
No, that's a fair point. But look, obviously the domestic factors are weighing very strongly on both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in all of this. My question, though, is around what we can do in terms of boosting growth here in Australia. What decisions can be made at home? The Treasurer has been talking about what companies should do: less special dividends and share buybacks, more investment. He's also looking at some sort of investment allowance to encourage investment by businesses. Would you welcome that sort of move?
Look, I think encouraging businesses to invest in the future is very good in terms of their research and development, because you want businesses not just to think about the profit and loss statements for this year, but you want them to think about the future. That's good not just for the businesses themselves, but for the national economy. If the economy is going to continue to grow, then we need businesses to continue to expand. We need there to be the jobs of the future. We need that to ensure rising living standards. We can think...
So do they need some sort of incentive from the government? I mean, the company tax cut for big business is off the agenda now. Would you welcome some sort of government incentive?
Well, I think we need to look at exactly what we might be talking about there, but I think the idea of encouraging businesses to invest in research and development is very good, particularly in an age, David, where there's so much disruption going around. I mean, you think of a company like Kodak, which was such a big company, and of course, you know, when film stopped being developed, when film stopped being printed because of digital cameras, the company ceased to exist. If companies are going to survive, if the jobs of the future are going to be here in Australia, we need companies to invest in research and development to become more productive, to continue to grow.
I guess, look, interest rates are at historic lows. For that reason, there's every incentive there for businesses to invest. But the reasons they're not, they keep telling us, are energy prices. They're worried about that. They were also worried about the trade war, which we were talking about too. I mean, do you think if you were sitting around a board table right now or a management team, you would be opting to make big investments locally?
Well, I think you can always think about what the future of your company is. I mean, I sat on a bunch of boards before I became a Member of Parliament, and you're constantly thinking about, well, what's the future of the business, who are our future customers and so on, and what can we do to expand. I think a lot of the share dividends that were paid out earlier in the year reflected the fact that many businesses had bet on the fact that there might be a change of government. They were concerned about the franking dividend changes. They knew the market was concerned about that, and they wanted to make payments early. So I think we've seen a particular spike in part because of that. But I think it's important that businesses go back to thinking about, well, what does the future of their business look like? How can they be more productive? How can they ensure that they're not disrupted by technological change?
Final one, Julian Leeser, Pauline Hanson. She's been with a film crew at Uluru. What do you make of all of this? Should politicians be climbing the rock taking camera crews along, or should they steer clear now?
Well, look, I take the view that you're still able to climb the rock for a certain period into the future, but the traditional owners have been saying that they don't want us to climb the rock anymore, and very shortly that won't be possible anymore. I think we need to respect the views and wishes of the traditional owners there. I've never had the privilege of going to Uluru. I hope to visit at some point, but I wouldn't intend to climb it. I'd intend to respect the desires and wishes of the traditional owners.